Jake Martinez wiped the grease from his hands with a dirty rag, squinting at the alien transport ship's engine bay. The massive vessel hummed with unfamiliar technology, its crystalline power cores pulsing with soft blue light. After 3 months working as the only human mechanic aboard the Calorian trade ship Starwind's Grace, he had finally started understanding their biomechanical systems. "Human, you have done well," Captain Vexithera said, her scaled head nodding approvingly. The Calorian's serpentine body moved with fluid grace as she approached the engine compartment. "The efficiency has increased by 12% since you began your modifications." Jake smiled, pride swelling in his chest. When he'd answered the posting for an off-world mechanic position, he never imagined he'd be the first human to work alongside the enigmatic Calorians. Their technology was centuries ahead of Earth's, but they seemed genuinely impressed by human intuition and creative problem-solving. "Just applying some old Earth engineering principles," Jake replied, closing the access panel. "Sometimes the simplest solutions work best, even with advanced tech." The ship shuddered slightly as it entered the atmosphere of Zarian 7, a desert planet on the outer rim of known space. Jake had heard stories about this world, ancient ruins buried in endless dunes, strange energy signatures that interfered with most scanning equipment, and rumors of creatures that defied classification. "We will be conducting archaeological surveys for the next rotation," Captain Vexithara explained. "The University of Calorian Sciences believes this world holds artifacts from the first civilization. Your expertise with primitive technology may prove valuable in understanding any mechanical devices we discover." Jake nodded, though something in the captain's tone made him uneasy. Throughout their journey, he'd noticed subtle changes in the crew's behavior. Hushed conversations that stopped when he approached. Glances that lingered too long. The universal translator picked up most of their language, but lately they'd been speaking in dialects it couldn't process. The landing was smooth, the ship's biomechanical legs extending to grip the sandy surface. Through the viewports, Jake could see nothing but rolling dunes stretching to the horizon, broken only by strange rock formations that looked almost organic in nature. "Prepare the survey teams," Vexithara commanded her crew. "Standard archaeological protocols, full environmental suits. The atmosphere is barely tolerable for most species." Jake spent the next hour helping prepare the expedition equipment. The Calorians used fascinating devices. Ground-penetrating scanners that looked more grown than built, excavation tools that seemed to adapt their shape based on the material they encountered. As the only human aboard, he wasn't assigned to any specific team, but was told to remain available for technical support. It was Lieutenant Sektar who approached him as the teams prepared to depart. The young Calorian's scales had a nervous shimmer to them, and his eyes wouldn't meet Jake's. "The captain requests you perform maintenance checks on the emergency beacon array," Sektar said quickly. "Location coordinates are in your datapad. Standard procedure before archaeological operations." Jake frowned. "I checked all communications equipment yesterday. Everything was functioning perfectly." "New protocols," Sektar replied, already backing away. "Captain's orders." Something felt wrong, but Jake had learned not to question Calorian military procedures. Their society was built on strict hierarchies and honor codes that humans were still learning to understand. He gathered his tools and checked the coordinates. The beacon array was located about 3 kilometers from the landing site, near a cluster of the strange rock formations. The desert heat hit him like a physical blow as soon as he stepped outside the ship's environmental field. Even through his suit's cooling systems, he could feel the oppressive temperature. The twin suns of Zarian 7 blazed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the endless dunes. Jake made his way across the sand, following the GPS coordinates on his pad. The rock formations grew larger as he approached, revealing themselves to be more than simple stone. They were carved, covered in intricate patterns that seemed to shift and move when he wasn't looking directly at them. Ancient architecture that predated known civilization by millennia. The beacon array was positioned between two of the largest formations, its metallic structure looking starkly out of place among the organic curves of the ruins. Jake began his diagnostics, running standard checks on the transmission equipment. Everything appeared to be functioning normally, just as he'd expected. That's when he heard the engines. Jake looked up to see the Starwind's Grace lifting off in the distance, its biomechanical form rising gracefully into the pale sky. Confusion turned to alarm as he activated his comm unit. "Captain Vexithera, this is Jake. I'm still conducting the maintenance checks you requested. Please respond." Silence. "Starwind's Grace. Please respond. You appear to be departing ahead of schedule." Still nothing. Jake watched in growing horror as the ship climbed higher, its form becoming a distant speck against the alien sky. He tried every communication frequency, emergency channels, even the maintenance diagnostic network. Complete radio silence. The realization hit him like a cold wave despite the desert heat. He'd been abandoned. Jake's mind raced as he tried to process what was happening. Why would the Calorians leave him here? Had he done something wrong? Violated some cultural taboo he wasn't aware of? Or was this something more sinister? His environmental suit beeped a warning. In his shock, he'd been breathing heavily, using up his air supply faster than normal. According to the display, he had maybe 6 hours of life support remaining. The emergency beacon he'd been maintaining was sending out a standard operational signal. No distress call, no indication that anyone needed rescue. Jake forced himself to think logically. Panic would only waste precious oxygen and energy. He needed to assess his situation and identify his options. Water. The suit had maybe 2 liters in its recycling system. Not nearly enough for extended survival in this heat. Food. Emergency rations for about 3 days, assuming he could manage his metabolism carefully. Shelter. The ancient ruins might provide some protection from the suns and the creatures that reportedly roamed this world at night. Communication. His suit's transmitter had limited range, but perhaps he could modify the beacon array to send a proper distress signal. Jake walked back to the beacon, studying its construction with new urgency. The Calorian technology was sophisticated, but followed logical engineering principles. If he could access the primary transmission array and boost the signal's strength, maybe someone would hear his call for help. As he worked, removing access panels and studying the biomechanical circuits, Jake's anger began to build alongside his determination. He'd trusted the Calorians, had genuinely believed they valued his contribution to their mission. The betrayal stung more than the physical danger he now faced. But Jake Martinez hadn't survived growing up in the Detroit Industrial District, hadn't earned his engineering degrees while working 3 jobs, hadn't been selected for the first human interspecies exchange program by giving up when things got difficult. The beacon's internal structure was more complex than he'd anticipated. Instead of simple electronic components, it used a hybrid system that combined traditional circuits with living tissue, biological computers that could adapt and evolve their programming. Jake had to be careful not to damage the organic components while accessing the transmission array. As the twin suns began their descent toward the horizon, painting the desert in shades of orange and red, Jake finally managed to isolate the beacon's core systems. The modifications would be tricky, requiring him to essentially teach the biomechanical circuits to ignore their original programming and focus entirely on broadcasting a distress signal. It was then that he heard the sound. A low, mournful cry echoing across the dunes, unlike anything in Earth's fossil record or the xenobiology databases he'd studied. The sound was answered by another, then another, coming from different directions around his position. Jake looked up from his work to see shapes moving among the ancient ruins. Large forms, pale as moonlight, flowing across the sand with surprising grace despite their obvious size. As they drew closer, Jake could make out more details that made his breath catch in his throat. Dragons. Not the mythical creatures of Earth's legends, but something far more magnificent and alien. Their bodies were serpentine and elegant, covered in scales that seemed to glow with their own inner light. They had 6 legs ending in delicate, almost hand-like appendages, and wings that looked more like solar sails than traditional flying membranes. But something was wrong with them. Even from a distance, Jake could see that these magnificent creatures were injured. Their movements were labored, and several showed signs of wounds that hadn't healed properly. Their scales, which should have been lustrous white, were dull and patchy in places. As the largest of the dragons approached, Jake realized why the Calorians had really brought him to this planet. Why they'd abandoned him here with nothing but basic tools and limited supplies. These weren't just any dragons. They were the legendary albino dragons of Zerion 7, creatures that xenobiologists had theorized about but never confirmed, and judging by their condition, someone had been hunting them. The dragon stopped about 20 meters away, regarding Jake with intelligent eyes that held depths of ancient wisdom and current pain. It spoke, its voice a harmonious blend of tones that his universal translator struggled to interpret. "Human, why do you not flee? Your species' ships brought fire and nets, brought death to our kindred." Jake felt his heart sink as the pieces fell into place. The Calorians hadn't brought him here as a valued crew member. They'd brought him as bait or as a scapegoat. The archaeological expedition was a cover for a hunting operation, and they'd left him here to take the blame when authorities inevitably investigated the dragon's disappearance. "I'm not with them," Jake said, surprised that his voice remained steady. "They left me here to die. I'm trying to call for help, but—" He gestured helplessly at his meager supplies and the partially modified beacon. The dragon's great head tilted, studying him with those ancient eyes. "You speak truth, small one. We sense no deception in your words. But your species' ships circle overhead still, beyond the cloud layer. They wait for the sacred pools to fully charge before they strike again." Sacred pools? Jake looked around the ruins with new understanding. The carved patterns weren't just decorative, they were functional. The entire complex was some kind of massive energy collection and storage system, probably powered by the twin suns' radiation. "How many of you are left?" Jake asked. 12, the dragon replied, and the sadness in its voice was unmistakable. "Once we numbered in the hundreds, but the hunters came with their nets of energy and their weapons that burn through scale and bone. They seek our hearts, human. Our life crystals hold power that could fuel their ships for generations." Jake felt sick. The Calorians weren't just hunting for sport or specimens. They were harvesting the dragons for their energy cores, treating these intelligent, ancient beings as nothing more than biological batteries. "The sacred pools will reach full charge when both suns reach zenith tomorrow," the dragon continued. "If we cannot drink from them soon, the remaining 12 will fade. Already, 3 of our youngest weaken beyond recovery." Jake looked at the beacon array, then at the injured dragons scattered among the ruins. His situation had just become infinitely more complicated. It wasn't just about his own survival anymore. The Calorians had made one critical mistake in their plan. They'd assumed that humans, faced with certain death and the choice between self-preservation and helping others, would choose themselves. They'd clearly never met anyone from Detroit. "What's your name?" Jake asked the dragon. "I am called Luminara, speaker for the last clutch. And you, human who speaks without lies?" "Jake Martinez, engineer, and apparently the only person standing between you and extinction." He shouldered his toolkit and looked at the ancient energy collection system surrounding them. "Tell me everything you know about how these sacred pools work. If we're going to survive this, We're going to need every advantage we can get. As the alien night fell and strange constellations emerged overhead, Jake began planning the most impossible engineering project of his life. Somewhere above the clouds, Calorian ships waited to complete their genocide. But they hadn't counted on human stubbornness, ingenuity, and the peculiar tendency of his species to adopt lost causes as personal crusades. The dragons gathered around him as he worked, their scales providing a gentle luminescence that helped him see the intricate mechanisms carved into the ancient stone. For the first time since being abandoned, Jake smiled. The Calorians wanted to play games? Fine. But they were about to learn why humans had a saying about what happened when you backed someone into a corner with nothing left to lose. The twin suns had been climbing steadily for 3 hours, and Jake's shirt was already soaked with sweat, despite his suit's cooling systems working overtime. Around him, the 12 remaining albino dragons moved with increasing desperation, their scales growing dimmer with each passing hour. The sacred pools carved into the ancient stone were beginning to glow, collecting solar energy as they had for millennia, but they weren't charging fast enough. Jake wiped his forehead and stepped back from the mechanism he'd been working on since before dawn. What he'd discovered about the sacred pools had changed everything he thought he knew about the dragons and this planet. The pools weren't just simple energy collectors. They were part of a vast, interconnected system that spanned the entire planet. A network of power distribution that had once supported a civilization capable of interstellar travel. The dragons weren't just users of this system. They were its guardians, their life crystals serving as both keys and amplifiers for the ancient technology. "The charging rate is insufficient," Luminara said, her mental voice heavy with exhaustion. Jake had discovered that the dragons communicated primarily through telepathy, though they could produce audible sounds when needed. At this pace, the pools will not reach full capacity until the suns are past zenith. By then, it will be too late for our youngest. Jake looked over at the 3 young dragons lying in the shade of a carved archway. They were barely the size of earth horses, their scales flickering weakly like dying light bulbs. Unlike their elders, they couldn't survive extended periods without energy from the sacred pools. "What if we could accelerate the charging process?" Jake asked, studying the intricate patterns carved into the stone around the pools. "Your ancestors designed this system, but they might not have anticipated modern technology." He pulled out his portable fusion battery, standard equipment for off-world mechanics. It was small but powerful, designed to provide emergency power for critical ship systems. Jake had been saving it as a last resort for his beacon modifications, but seeing the dying dragons had shifted his priorities. "The sacred patterns cannot be altered, human Jake," rumbled Thaindar, one of the elder dragons. His scales bore scars from recent battles with Calorian hunting nets. "They have remained unchanged since the first builders placed them. To tamper with them would be sacrilege." "Not tamper," Jake said, connecting diagnostic cables to his battery. "Enhance. Look at these carvings. They're not just decorative. They're circuit paths, designed to channel and amplify energy. But they're passive systems. What if we could add an active component?" Jake had spent most of the night studying the pool's construction, using every scanning device in his toolkit. The carved patterns formed a complex circuit that converted solar radiation into a form of energy the dragons could metabolize. It was elegant engineering, but it was also limited by the natural charging rate. "If I can integrate my fusion battery into the circuit, it might kickstart the charging process," Jake continued, already working to modify the connection points. "The battery's energy output is different from solar radiation, but the conversion patterns should be able to adapt." Luminara approached, her great eyes reflecting concern. "Human Jake, you do not understand the risks. The sacred pools are more than energy sources. They are linked to every dragon that has ever lived on this world. To alter their function could damage the connection between our people and our ancestors. Jake paused, his hands hovering over the fusion battery's controls. He was asking them to trust him with something sacred, something that connected them to their entire history. It was like asking someone to let a stranger rewire their family's ancestral shrine. A weak cry from one of the young dragons made the decision for him. "I know I'm asking a lot," Jake said quietly. "But right now, preserving your people's future is more important than maintaining perfect traditions. If this doesn't work, you can remove the modifications after the crisis passes." The elder dragons exchanged glances, their telepathic communication creating a subtle harmony that Jake could almost feel at the edge of his consciousness. Finally, Luminara nodded. "Do what you must, human Jake. We trust in your good intentions, even if we fear the consequences." Jake connected the fusion battery to the sacred pool's circuit through a series of adapters and voltage regulators he'd improvised from his toolkit. The moment the connection was complete, the carved patterns around the pool blazed with new light. The energy level indicators he'd attached showed the charging rate had increased by over 400%. "It's working," Jake breathed, watching as the nearest young dragon's scales began to brighten. "The fusion energy is being converted and amplified by your ancestors' technology." But their success was short-lived. "Ships approaching," Thaindar announced grimly, his head raised toward the sky. 3 vessels, descending through the cloud layer. The hunters return." Jake looked up to see distant specks growing larger against the pale morning sky. The Calorian ships moved with predatory grace, their biomechanical hulls gleaming in the sunlight. They were smaller than the Starwind's Grace, but heavily armed, designed for hunting rather than transport. "How long until the pools are fully charged?" Jake asked, checking his improvised system. "At current rate, perhaps 2 hours," Luminara replied. "But the hunters will not wait so long. They carry stasis nets and energy drains. Once they begin their attack, we will be unable to reach the pools." Jake studied the approaching ships, his mind racing through possibilities. The dragons were weakened and couldn't fight effectively. The sacred pools needed more time to charge, and somewhere in orbit, the Starwind's Grace was probably coordinating the entire operation. Then he remembered something Captain Vexithara had said about the beacon array he'd been sent to maintain. It wasn't just a communication device. It was part of a network used to coordinate planetary operations. If he could hack into that network... "I need to get back to the beacon array," Jake announced, gathering his tools. "There might be a way to level the playing field." "Human Jake, the ships will see you if you leave the ruins," Thaindar warned. "The open desert offers no concealment." Jake looked at the ancient stone formations surrounding them, noting how their organic curves seemed to blend with the natural landscape. "Then I won't be in the open desert. How good are you at flying with a passenger?" 20 minutes later, Jake found himself clinging to Luminara's neck as she soared between the massive stone structures, using them as cover to approach the beacon array. The experience was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. The dragon's powerful wings caught thermal currents with incredible efficiency, and her flight path seemed to anticipate air currents before they formed. "Calorian hunting ships rely heavily on automated targeting systems," Jake explained as they flew, his voice lost in the wind but his thoughts clear in the telepathic link Luminara maintained. "If I can access their network through the beacon, I might be able to introduce some complications." They landed near the beacon array just as the first hunting ship began its attack run on the ruins. Energy nets sparked between its weapon pods, designed to entangle and disable the dragons without damaging their valuable life crystals. Jake worked frantically to hack into the beacon's network interface, using security backdoors he'd discovered during his months aboard the Starwind's Grace. Calorian technology was sophisticated, but it followed predictable patterns. and Jake had learned to think like their systems. "Got it," he muttered, accessing the hunting ship's targeting network. "Let's see how well they hunt when their sensors can't tell a dragon from a sand dune." Jake uploaded a modified virus into the network, not designed to damage the ships but to corrupt their sensor data. Target identification protocols began misinterpreting readings, weapon systems started acquiring locks on shadows and rock formations, and navigation computers began questioning their own positioning data. The effect was immediate. The first hunting ship's attack run went wide, its energy nets striking empty sand. The second ship fired at a carved rock formation, apparently convinced it was a dragon trying to hide. The third ship began circling erratically, its autopilot fighting with conflicted sensor data. "Impressive, human Jake," Luminara observed as they watched the confused ships. "But this will only delay them. Once they realize their systems have been compromised, they will switch to manual control." Jake nodded, already anticipating that problem. "Then we need to make sure they don't get the chance. How's your aim from altitude?" What followed was the strangest dogfight in recorded history. Luminara climbed high above the hunting ships, using her natural camouflage and the sensor corruption to remain undetected. When the first ship's crew began manually overriding their targeting systems, Jake had the dragon dive at them from directly above, the one angle their weapons couldn't cover effectively. But instead of attacking the ship directly, Jake had a different plan. As they swooped past the vessel's hull, he attached one of his modified signal boosters to its communication array. The device immediately began broadcasting feedback into their network, amplifying the sensor corruption and making it impossible to filter out. They repeated the process with the second ship, turning their own communication systems against them. By the time they reached the third vessel, its crew was in full panic mode, unable to trust any of their instruments and afraid to fire weapons without clear targets. "This is Hunt Leader Kesavel to Orbital Command," Jake heard through his intercepted communications. "Ground operation compromised. All ships experiencing critical system failures. Recommend immediate withdrawal for diagnostics." Jake grinned as he listened to the hunting ships retreat to orbit, their crews convinced they'd encountered some kind of planet-wide electronic defense system. The dragons were safe for now, but the respite wouldn't last long. "The pools should be fully charged within the hour," Luminara reported as they returned to the ruins. "But the hunters will return once they realize their ships were sabotaged." Jake nodded, watching the young dragons as they began to move more energetically. The fusion battery integration had worked better than he'd hoped. Not only were the pools charging faster, but the energy they produced seemed more potent than usual. "Then we need to be ready for them," Jake said, studying the ancient carved patterns with new understanding. "Your ancestors didn't just build energy collectors here. They built a fortress, and I think I know how to activate its defenses." The sacred pools were part of a larger system, Jake had realized. The entire ruins complex was a single massive machine, designed to collect and channel energy on a planetary scale. But it had been dormant for so long that even the dragons had forgotten its full capabilities. "The patterns aren't just for the pools," Jake explained, tracing the carved lines that covered every surface. "They're a power distribution network. If we can channel enough energy through the main circuits, this whole complex should come online." "Human Jake, such knowledge has been lost for generations," Thaindar protested. "Even if you are correct, we do not know how to safely activate the ancient systems." Jake smiled, pulling out his engineering tablet and connecting it to the sacred pool's modified circuit. "Then it's a good thing you have a human engineer who specializes in reverse engineering alien technology." As the dragons gathered around the fully charged sacred pools to restore their strength, Jake began the most complex hack of his career. He was about to wake up a sleeping giant that had been dormant for millennia, using nothing but intuition, determination, and the kind of stubborn human refusal to accept the impossible. Above them, Calorian ships regrouped in orbit, preparing for a second assault. But this time, they would find the dragons defended by something they'd never encountered before. A human mechanic with nothing to lose and a really bad attitude about people who hurt his friends. The sacred pools pulsed with new energy as Jake's modifications reached full integration with the ancient systems. Around him, the carved patterns began to glow with increasing intensity, and deep within the ruins, mechanisms that hadn't moved in eons started coming to life. The dragon's scales brightened as they absorbed the pure energy they needed to survive, but more than that, they were becoming something more than they had been in centuries. The enhanced pools weren't just restoring them, they were awakening capabilities their people hadn't possessed since the fall of their ancient civilization. Jake felt a deep satisfaction as he watched the transformation. The Calorians had made a crucial mistake when they'd abandoned him here. They'd assumed that one human mechanic couldn't possibly threaten their operation. They were about to learn just how wrong they were. The entire ruins complex hummed with awakening power as Jake made the final connection to the ancient defense grid. Around him, carved patterns that had been dormant for millennia blazed with golden light, and deep beneath the sand, massive mechanisms stirred to life. The 12 albino dragons stood transformed, their scales now radiating with energy levels that made them appear almost divine. "Human Jake," Luminara's mental voice carried notes of awe and terror in equal measure. "What have you awakened?" Jake stepped back from his makeshift control interface, watching as status displays he'd jerry-rigged from his toolkit showed power levels climbing toward critical mass. The sacred pools weren't just energy sources, they were the heart of a planetary defense network that had once protected this world from extinction-level threats. "Something your ancestors built to protect their people," Jake replied, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cooling systems in his suit. "And something we're going to use to protect their descendants." Above them, the Calorian hunting fleet had finished regrouping. Jake's sensor feeds showed 8 ships descending through the atmosphere, their crews determined to complete their mission despite the earlier technical difficulties. This time, they were coming with full manual control and heavier weapons. "Orbital command to all hunting vessels," Jake heard through his intercepted communications. "The human saboteur must be eliminated before harvesting can proceed. Weapons free on all targets. Acceptable losses are set at 70% of remaining specimens." Jake's jaw clenched at their casual discussion of genocide. The Calorians weren't just hunting the dragons for their energy crystals. They were planning to wipe out the entire species and keep only enough alive for breeding stock. "Thaindar, how many of your people can fly combat formations?" Jake asked, studying the approaching ships on his scanner. "All of us, human Jake," the scarred elder replied. "But we have not fought as warriors for many generations. Our weapons are ceremonial, our tactics forgotten." Jake looked at the transformed dragons, noting how their enhanced energy levels had changed more than just their appearance. Their movements were more fluid, their reactions faster, and there was a predatory awareness in their eyes that hadn't been there before. "Maybe," Jake said slowly, "but your ancestors' weapons aren't ceremonial." He activated the primary control sequence he'd spent the last hour programming, and the results were immediate and spectacular. The carved stone formations around them began to shift and reconfigure, revealing weapon systems that defied easy classification. Energy cannons emerged from hidden compartments, their crystalline focusing arrays already beginning to charge. Force field generators created shimmering barriers of hardened air, and from the deepest chambers beneath the ruins, something much larger began to rise. "By the first builders," Thaindar whispered, his mental voice filled with religious awe. "The Guardian awakens." Jake watched in amazement as a massive construct emerged from beneath the central plaza. It stood nearly 50 meters tall. its form resembling a gigantic version of the albino dragons but clearly artificial. Ancient armor plating covered biomechanical muscles that moved with impossible grace, and its eyes glowed with the same golden energy that powered the sacred pools. Your ancestors didn't just build defenses, Jake realized. They built a guardian angel. The approaching Calorian ships opened fire as soon as they came within range, energy beams and missile pods targeting both the ruins and the transformed dragons. But the ancient defense grid responded instantly, force fields deflecting incoming fire while energy cannons returned devastating volleys that sent the attackers scrambling for evasive maneuvers. "This is Hunt Leader Kesavel to Orbital Command," Jake heard through the chaos of battle communications. "The ruins have activated some kind of ancient weapon system. We're taking heavy casualties." "Maintain attack formation," came the cold reply from the Star Wind's grace. "The specimens are too valuable to abandon. Use cluster charges if necessary." Jake felt his blood run cold. Cluster charges were area effect weapons designed to level entire city blocks. The Calorians were willing to destroy the entire archaeological site rather than let the dragons escape. "Luminara, can you and your people interface directly with the ancient systems?" Jake asked urgently. "I can operate them from here, but you might be able to do more." The great dragon approached the central control platform, placing one of her delicate hand-like appendages on the golden interface crystal. The moment she made contact, her scales flared with brilliant light, and Jake's instruments showed power levels spiking throughout the entire network. "We remember," Luminara said, but her voice had changed, becoming deeper and more resonant. "The memories of our ancestors flow through these circuits. We are the keys of the first builders, and we remember our purpose." The other dragons joined her, each one connecting to different control nodes throughout the ruins. As they did, the Guardian construct's movements became more coordinated, its responses more intelligent. It wasn't just an automated defense system. It was an avatar for the collective consciousness of the dragon species. The battle turned quickly after that. The Guardian moved with impossible speed for something its size, using weapons that bent the laws of physics as Jake understood them. Energy beams that curved around obstacles to strike targets, gravitational fields that pulled attacking ships out of formation, shield projectors that not only blocked incoming fire, but reflected it back at the attackers with added force. But the real surprise came when the dragons themselves joined the fight. Enhanced by their connection to the ancient network, they were no longer the weakened refugees Jake had first encountered. They moved like living stars, their scales generating energy fields that deflected weapon fire. Their breath weapons, which Jake had assumed were mythological, turned out to be concentrated plasma streams powered by their internal energy crystals. "This is impossible!" Hunt Leader Kesavel's panicked voice echoed through the communications net. "The specimens are exhibiting capabilities far beyond our intelligence reports. How are they powering these weapons?" Jake grinned as he watched a formation of dragons execute a perfect pincer maneuver against two hunting ships, their coordinated plasma strikes overwhelming the vessel's shields. That's what happens when you mess with an engineer who's had a really bad day. The tide of battle was turning decisively in favor of the dragons, but Jake knew the real fight was yet to come. The Star Wind's grace was still in orbit, and Captain Vexithara wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully. She'd escalate rather than retreat, which meant, "Orbital bombardment incoming," Jake shouted, his sensors detecting massive energy signatures building aboard the command ship. "Everyone take cover!" The bombardment was devastating. Energy beams powerful enough to crack continents, striking the ruins with pinpoint precision. But the ancient builders had anticipated such attacks. The Guardian raised its arms, and from its palms projected shield barriers that absorbed and redistributed the orbital strike energy throughout the planetary grid. "Impossible," Captain Vexithara's voice cut through the battle chatter. These are first civilization technologies. They've been extinct for 10,000 years. Not extinct, Jake replied, activating his own communication system to broadcast directly to the Calorian fleet. Just sleeping, and you've made them very angry. The response was immediate. The Guardian's eyes blazed with accumulated energy, and it fired a beam that pierced straight through the atmosphere to strike the Starwind's Grace directly. The massive ship's shields collapsed instantly, and secondary explosions began tearing through its hull. "This is Captain Vexithera to all vessels," came the defeated transmission. "Full retreat. Mission abort. Repeat. Mission abort." Jake watched the surviving Calorian ships flee into hyperspace, their hunting expedition turned into a rout by creatures they'd thought were helpless prey. The orbital bombardment ceased, and an unusual quiet settled over the desert ruins. "It is finished," Luminara announced, her voice gradually returning to its normal tones as she disconnected from the ancient network. Around her, the other dragons were also stepping back from the control nodes, their scales slowly returning to their natural luminescence. "Not quite," Jake said, checking his instruments. The Guardian construct was slowly powering down, its massive form settling back into its resting position beneath the ruins. But the energy grid remained active, the sacred pools continuing to charge and maintain themselves. "What do you mean, human Jake?" Thaindar asked. Jake pulled out his modified beacon array, the same device he'd been sent to maintain when this whole adventure began. Over the past few hours, he'd been uploading everything to its memory banks: battle recordings, system schematics, evidence of the Calorian hunting operation. "The Calorians thought they could commit genocide in secret," Jake explained, activating the beacon's enhanced transmission system. "They thought no one would know what happened to the last albino dragons of Xerion 7. But this beacon is connected to every major communication network in this sector. In about 10 minutes, evidence of their war crimes will be transmitted to the Galactic Council, the Interspecies Trade Commission, and every major news network from here to Earth." The implications hit the dragons immediately. The Calorians weren't just criminals, they were a member species of the Galactic Council, bound by strict laws against the extinction of sentient races. "They will face justice for their actions," Luminara said with satisfaction. "Oh, they'll face more than justice," Jake replied, thinking of the political storm about to engulf Calorian space. "They'll face every species in the galaxy who suddenly realizes that if the Calorians will casually hunt dragons to extinction, no one is safe from their archaeological expeditions." As the twin suns reached their zenith and the sacred pools achieved full charge, Jake found himself surrounded by 12 healthy, powerful dragons whose species had just been pulled back from the brink of extinction. The ancient ruins hummed with restored purpose, their defense grid ready to protect this world from any future threats. "Human Jake," Luminara said formally, "the albino dragons of Xerion 7 owe you a debt that can never be repaid. You were abandoned to die in our desert, yet you chose to save us instead of seeking only your own survival. How can we honor such sacrifice?" Jake looked around at the magnificent creatures, at the awakened ruins that would ensure their protection, at the evidence of Calorian war crimes that would guarantee their justice. Then he looked at his environmental suit's displays, noting that he still had several days of life support remaining and a fully functional distress beacon. "Just make sure this never happens again," he said simply. "And maybe when the rescue ships arrive, you could put in a good word for humanity with the Galactic Council. We're new to the interstellar community, and a recommendation from the Guardians of First Civilization technology might open some interesting doors." Luminara's laugh was like the sound of crystal wind chimes in a gentle breeze. "Human Jake, after today, I believe your species needs no recommendations from us. Any civilization that produces individuals willing to face impossible odds to protect strangers will find welcome throughout the galaxy. as Jake settled in to wait for rescue, watching the dragons soar through the ancient ruins that were now both their home and their fortress. He couldn't help but smile. The Calorians had thought they were abandoning him to certain death in an empty desert. Instead, they'd given him the chance to wake up sleeping gods and make friends with dragons. All things considered, Jake thought as he watched the sunset paint the restored ruins in shades of gold and crimson, it had turned out to be a pretty good day after all. The beacon continued its transmission to the stars, carrying with it a message that would echo through the galaxy. Humanity had arrived, and they were not to be underestimated. Whether tied and left to die in alien deserts or facing impossible odds against superior technology, humans had a disturbing tendency to not only survive, but to make the universe a better place in the process. The age of humanity had begun, and it would be remembered as the era when ancient guardians awakened and dragons learned to trust again.